Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, past president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, which is also the sponsor for this show. And today our guest is my co-host, Chuck Mason. We're going to talk about something that is the hot topic of the genealogy world today, and that's the 1950 census. Chuck, what took the government so long to publish the 1950 census?
Well, there's a government regulation that restricts census information from being released for 72 years. And it was determined at one point by the government that that was the average age when they were looking at this issue and releasing the information. That was the average age of a person. So
Expected
that's when
expected lifetime?
They decided that 72 years would be the ruling. So
that's how that happened.
So that's how that happened. So the 1950 census is, number one, it's the first look at the country after World War I. Or World War II, yes, I'm looking at World War II. And it had a huge impact on the economy and also the social life of people. People were coming back, or men and women were coming back from the war. They were trying to find housing. Women were leaving wartime jobs, going back to being homemakers. Yeah. And we also had a big economic recession in 1947. And we also saw a big switch in people being a rural and farming community population to a more urban and suburban population. So we had 150 million people in 45 million homes being enumerated.
And the thing is, the government uses this information not only to determine representation for all the different states and regions, but also in planning, so that they know where is the population going to be, what are the needs of the population, and that kind of thing too.
Right. So we have, with the census itself, we have a whole different look to it. Every copy of the form that I have seen, it's a nice shade of green ink, but the forms are in green ink. Doesn't necessarily make them great for using them for examples and things in presentations. But we also, the layout, the 1940 census had 40 lines per page. The 1950 has 30 lines per page. On the 1940 census, there were 2 people that were asked supplemental questions. On the 1950 census, we have 6 people. And as I have looked at my family, they either are one below or the last member in the household is one above the supplemental questions. Of the people I've found so far, there's only one that I've had supplemental questions, and they were under 14, so there wasn't any information.
And from what I understand, the supplemental questions are a sample. The government has decided they didn't need to ask everybody those questions, but they just took a sort of a
sampling of things.
And was it a random sample, or were there certain
specific lines on the census?
Okay. However you fell on the census.
If you were line number
10,
I forget what the line numbers were, but if you were one of those line numbers, then you went down and answered the initial questions. But if you were not 14 or older, you didn't answer them all. So you answered like the first 2 or 3 if you were 14, and that was it.
Okay.
So we also have something that the government for the first time was trying to do, and that was get information and enumerate people who were living abroad. So we had people who were in the armed forces, they were serving on ships. Also, U.S. government employees, like the people who staffed the embassies around the world.
Occupational
Kinds of things.
Forces and stuff.
So they did an enumeration night, different from April 1st. It was April 11th. But they did this for people who were in these categories around the world. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to find the whole population. For example, I have an uncle who was in the military in 1940. Can't find the family.
Oh.
I don't know specifically where they were, but they're not in the 1940 census. So the other thing that they did, they published in newspapers what they called a missing persons form. And the purpose of this was if somebody knew they had been not been enumerated, were not home or whatever, they could clip this form out, fill it out, and send it into the Census Bureau. So they would add those into the census. So it has always been important to look at the end of the census just to see in the earlier censuses if somebody was missed initially, but the census taker went back and got them, caught up with them, got the information, it was put in the end of the form.
The end of the form, so it wouldn't necessarily be in the enumeration district.
Well, it would be in the enumeration district, but not in the page. For example, 1950, when I found my parents and myself, the very first page of the enumeration district was we lived over top of a store. The people that owned the store and lived in the back and the apartment over top of the store were enumerated. My parents evidently were not home that night because we are on the last page or the next to the last page of the census. So they didn't leave space and put them in, they put them at the end. And I found with the 1940, at least Gloucester County, New Jersey, and Deptford Township within the county, there were lots of people that were not home that I see not at home, not at home, not at home.
But they actually in the ED
place,
area they would say
yes.
Not at home.
So there was the couple.
You know to look.
There was the couple that owned the store.
Yeah.
There was the couple that lived in the apartment above, and then there was not at home. And then it moved down to the parsonage of the Methodist Church, which was next door, and the minister and his family were enumerated. But my parents are on, it's either the last page or next last page, I forget.
So that's just sort of a word to the wise that if you see that where your family should be, well then don't stop there. Go ahead and look at the end.
Yes, well, of course, hopefully, at this point there's not an index, but there are, and we'll talk about in a few minutes, ways on different websites that you can take and hopefully find people easier than going through the entire enumeration district. So one of the other things that they also were doing with this census was they were recording children born in January, February, and March separately in addition to the census form. There was a separate card that was filled out. And what the government was doing with these was they were checking to see are births being registered as they should be in the states. The unfortunate thing is, after they completed the project, they destroyed the cards. So they weren't microfilmed. So don't bother to look for them.
Oh my goodness.
And this was the last census that was taken by census enumerators. Beginning in 1960, forms were mailed out and the household was to fill those out and return them to the Census Bureau. So that was another big change.
So what's some of the stuff that was captured? What were the questions, and were these questions different from other years?
In some cases, yes. You began with the street name or road or where the household was located, because I still find I've looked at some rural areas and they didn't necessarily have street names.
Yeah, right.
So I've seen route numbers
Right,
or
rural
things like that.
delivery.
So, the location, the apartment or the house number. And then there was something called a serial number or dwelling unit. And these were the numbers that, as the census enumerator visited, they're numbering things as they come to a household, which we've had before.
Yeah.
This time they ask, is the house on a farm or a ranch?
Right.
Then is the house on a piece of land that is 3 acres or more?
Okay.
So,
that's
again,
getting
we're,
to the
we're
urbanization.
getting to the urbanization. There was also an agricultural questionnaire, and so that number was placed on there. But I have been told, unfortunately, after they finished with those questionnaires, they didn't hold on to them. So it's not like those ones back in the 1880s and 70s and 60s. You don't have those. Then you have the individuals, starting with the head of the household and everybody who is there, the relationship to the head of the household, race, sex, and the person's age at their last birthday. And then it asks for marital status a little more than we've had in the past. Now married, widowed, divorced, separated, or never married.
That's interesting.
So you get a couple of more categories
Yeah.
there. And for example, the separated one was of interest for my mother's parents, because my mother's parents had separated in the 1930s, lived 2 blocks from each other, but never divorced.
Not together. Right?
So they were listed as separated. Also, what state or country the person was born in, the individuals. We no longer get the parents' places of birth that we used to get.
Yeah.
But it did also ask if they were foreign born, were they naturalized?
Okay.
So that,
That's
was
typical.
That was the basic questionnaire. Then they ask for people who were 14 or over. This is a period of time where, for example, with my mother's family, my mother's youngest brother was the only one that went to high school. Everybody else finished 8th grade and that was it.
Yep.
And went off to work.
Right.
So 14 was kind of that age where that would happen. So they started asking questions of everyone 14 or older. Was the person working, unable to work? Were they keeping house? Or something else that they were doing most of the week? If the person was keeping house or something else, did the person do any work in the last week that was not work around the household? So did they have a part-time job or had they been working? If the person said no, it asked, were they looking for work? Were they actually seeking it? If the answer was no, even if they didn't work last week, did they have a job or a business of some sort? And if the person is working, how many hours did they work in the last week?
Okay.
That one's interesting. We think of the 40-hour work week.
Yeah.
I see lots of people working 60 hours or more.
Oh, wow.
What kind of business or industry were they employed in? For example, if they were a nurse, were they working in a hospital or a doctor's office? And of course, it had also asked what kind of work did they do. And then there was the classification of the work. Was it a private employer? Were they working for the government? Did they own their own business? Were they working in a family business or on the family farm where they were not necessarily paid a salary? So
that's important.
And then we get to the 6 people who answered the supplemental questions. And this was initially for anyone. Were they living in the same house a year ago? If they lived in the, if they were living on a farm a year ago, were they living in the same county a year ago? If no, then what county or what country or state or foreign country were they living in a year ago? What were where were their father and mother born? What country? The highest level of education that they attended. Did they finish that grade? And then have they attended school since February 1st, 1950? Then we get, if the people are over the age of 14, then we get a few more questions. If they had said they were looking for work, how many weeks have they been looking for work? If they had said earlier in 1949, how many weeks did the person do any work, not including working around the house? Also, in 1949, how much money did they earn working as an employee for wages or salary before taxes or any deductions? In 1949 rather, how much money did they earn working in their own business, their own professional practice, like if they were a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer, or the farm? And that was to be net income. And in 1949, how much money did relatives in the household receive from either interest, dividends, veterans allowances, pensions, rents, or other forms of income? This excluded salary or wages. And if the person was male, did they serve in the armed forces during World War I, World War II, or any other military service? And then a couple of more questions for only the last person on the last supplemental line. And these were questions about the person's employment, depending on earlier answers in the census. So you have some really good questions, like I say, that went away about where did people come from and things like that, but you're getting more of a picture of the economic status of the family. Like I said, with my mother's siblings, hit 8th grade, they all went off to work after they finished 8th grade. My father's family, my grandfather was an employee on a dairy farm, and the boys all worked on the dairy farm at one point or another. So everybody. My father had an older brother and his sister who finished high school. The other two boys and my father elected not to complete high school. So my father told the story at the end of 10th grade. His father said he's going back to school in the fall, and he said no, and my grandfather said, then go find a job. You're not laying around the house, but he wasn't that polite about it.
So there were also some questions about the condition of the house that you were living in too. I noticed that there were some definitions of what a dilapidated house was. And I when I read that and I thought about it, that was sort of the enumerator had to make those decisions on how dilapidated your house was. And that's the first time I've ever seen any kind of question about that.
And of course we had ones earlier about being deaf, dumb, blind, and all, and on earlier censuses, and like things there that people might not have been trained, people with handicaps and things like that we know more about today. Were just possibly written off as, not being with it, shall we say.
Exactly.
So, that's basically the census in a nutshell. And then we have, how do we get to the census? as we said earlier, the census was released. It was released on the 1st of March. It was released not just on the National Archives website, but Family Search, Ancestry, and Heritage Quest all also had access to the censuses. None of them are indexed.
Right.
Well, and of course, we had that with 1940 too.
There's a little indexing going on,
Yeah.
and so how are they asking the public to help?
Yes, they are all putting out requests. If you go to any of the websites, there's a spot where you can volunteer. Genealogical societies, I know Mount Vernon and Fairfax both have asked people to participate in the program. If you're doing it as an individual, you can select where you want to do the indexing. For, I believe, both Mount Vernon and Fairfax, they're asking them to do Virginia locations.
Sure, that makes sense.
So I could go and say I want to index Deptford Township in Gloucester County, where I grew up, so that those things would be. But there is a little bit of a way that you can take and go. So we have a slide of the narrow web page, the opening web page, if they could put that up. Okay, there it begins, or there it is. And now also on the NARA website, they have lots of articles about the census and all. So it's worth going to the page and looking through them.
They have little videos and other things that are worthwhile.
So then once you click to begin a search, if you bring up the second slide, you can search for a family. So what you have to put in there is the state, the county, and then a name. So I put Mason, my surname. I expected to find my father's parents, my mother and father, and at least one of my father's brothers. So I clicked on that, and if you go to the next slide, what it does is it gives you the name Mason in all of the enumeration districts. So you can go down, then you click on an enumeration district, and of course when I did this, my parents, as I said, weren't where I expected them. So I went through the pages in that section, and that was the slide that we just had, was the page my parents and I were on. So that's how I found them.
So if you knew the general area where they were in, then you could go in and find that one page that would say all the Masons that lived in that county?
Yes. Now what I did before I knew about this, I went in and I read the street descriptions within the enumeration district description. And so that's how I easily found my two grandparents were living in two separate households. My father's parents, the household that we were living in, because in both cases, my grandparents were in different enumeration districts because of where they lived within the enumeration district. So if we could have the next slide up. Okay, this is that listing, which will list whatever you put in for the criteria, because you can search just a surname, you can search a given name and a surname. Now, if you have a given name like William, my grandfather's, I wouldn't suggest doing that. Look for something more unique. Now, my father's sister was Mary Elizabeth, and they always called her Mary Elizabeth. So I did try that, but I didn't come up with finding them that way. So if we could now have the next slide. Okay, this was another page that I found, and this was where I found my grandparents.
And that part at the bottom is those
That's
are the
the
supplemental questions. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Okay, and if we could go to the next slide. Okay.
By the way,
That was a blow up of the finding them. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay.
Also on the supplemental, I just wanted to interject that there are codes.
Yes.
And you can go online and see
find
what
the
those codes are.
Yes. This is an enumeration district map for Deptford Township, and with all the enumeration districts. So if this were able to be raised big enough, I couldn't on my computer, you could see the streets within and get a better idea of the enumeration district.
And also, sorry to interrupt you again, those maps are available.
Yes.
Whereas in early years, those maps were not necessarily available, but
right.
now they are. So
yes.
it's important.
If we could go to the next slide. Stephen Morris has a way of finding records. And so I did a quick search. I knew my mother's oldest sister lived on Sanger Street in Philadelphia. So I put in Sanger Street, and you can see the line down the bottom. There's about 20 enumeration districts. I put a cross street in. If they bring up the next slide, it narrowed it down to 2 enumeration districts that I could then go and search through those to find my aunt and uncle.
Chuck, we're running out of time, but there's so much more to know about this, and you can go online. There's lots of videos, there's blogs, there's all kinds of things too, and eventually you'll be able to go to Ancestry and just put in your name, but it's going to take a while.
Ancestry, Family Search, and others are putting out information on their websites as they complete them.
Right.
I got an email on Friday, and I believe it's 7 states that they've
done.
completed, but they are the less populated states like Wyoming and out more in the rural areas, or Rhode Island, which is a smaller state.
Thank you, Chuck. This
You're
has
welcome.
been really interesting and also
and just
helpful.
a real quick snapshot of the census.
Yep, but very important.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome.